Well, thank you very much. Can I begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet and pay respects to elders past, present and emerging. Can I thank the Institute of Chartered Accountants of India for the invitation today and acknowledge Asha, the chair of this chapter, and we of course have people I suspect from right across Melbourne and right across the country here. So it's a great honour for me to be able to come here. And can I acknowledge Manoj and Praveen for their work in public policy more generally. So can I just start by saying that, look, I'm very conscious that as an economist, we come up with all sorts of weird and wacky theories, some of which may work occasionally, but you've then got to work out the ways to make sure that all the columns add up in the real world. And so I've got a great deal of respect for the accountancy profession and chartered accountants in particular. I've worked in all three levels of government, and I'm very conscious that accountants in the private sector, but also in the public sector, are the absolute linchpin of making sure that what we promise we'll do, we can do. And I've spent a lot of time in my career in what we call central agencies, so finance, treasury, and either premiers or prime ministers. And one of the key functions that I've led of those agencies is that we basically bring in all sorts of very worthwhile bids from right across government. It might be in justice, education, health, it might be infrastructure projects, and all those worthwhile bids always add up to 3 times more money than we have. And so part of the policy process and expenditure review committee is part of that, iterated rounds of whittling those down so that you can fit it within your budget. So there's a lot of policy process that goes on in whittling those down and making sure that they're as rigorous as possible. But of course, actually running your books, making sure that your revenue is stable, that your revenue is actually coming in, and that your expenditure is going to be what you plan for it to be. And that's where I think accounting plays an absolutely critical role. So I think economics and accounting are two parts of a broader analytical framework, but I just wanted to say that in my public sector and private sector experience, I've worked with a lot of people with your qualifications and experience in the past, and I think that we complement each other in very important ways. So I'll just make a couple of quick observations about the House Economics Committee. So unfortunately, I don't get really to decide where money goes. That's really the role of the executive. That's the Treasurer and the Minister for Finance, but I get to talk a lot about it. And that's important. You can frame discussions and you can hold inquiries into important subjects. And the Standing Committee on Economics, I would say this because I'm biased, but it is one of the more important committees of Parliament. And it has a tradition where it's the main forum for examining the Reserve Bank, for example, which is obviously something of particular importance at the moment. So we have 2 public hearings where we have a 3-hour grilling of the Reserve Bank every year, and also 2 in-camera sessions with the Reserve Bank every year. And they are very important forums. It is one of the key accountability mechanisms for the central bank. And that's always important, but in the last year in particular, it has been particularly important. So the Standing Committee on Economics has a key remit to look at the central bank's functioning, and obviously things like forward guidance and bond control, yield curve control have come under very, very close scrutiny over the last 6 to 12 months. We also have responsibility for a number of agencies, the ACCC, ASIC, APRA, AER, and others whose annual reports fall within our remit. So it's a very important committee, that ongoing process of scrutiny. There is also a role for periodic reviews. And in the previous 2 terms of Parliament, there were reviews into the big 4 banks, which were high profile and I think important. And those reviews were, if that is to continue over the course of this term, that's something we're currently looking at, that would obviously complement the work in examining the RBA, because when you look at the impacts of monetary policy, the RBA and the big 4 banks and other smaller banks are, in a sense, 2 sides of the same coin. The RBA sets the tax rate, the way that flows through to mortgages, the way that the banks see how that's going to impact on defaults, the way that the banks also respond, not just in mortgage rates, but in deposit rates. All of that impacts on the macro economy. So that ongoing examination of the big four banks is another very important one. And then there's periodic policy reviews. So the Standing Committee on Economics is a really important committee. Another committee that I'm on, which is very important, is the Joint Standing Committee. And joint means it has members of both the Senate and the House of Reps into corporations and securities. And that's really a committee that focuses very much on AFI. And many of the issues that it looks at would be of particular interest to this room. So I'm just a member of that committee. But one of the inquiries that we're holding at the moment is into insolvency, which you may or may not have seen, but that's going to be a major inquiry over the course of this year. So that's another committee that I'm on, but probably takes up less of my time than economics, but nonetheless a very important committee. And in a sense, they're two of the major economic policy committees which dovetail in many ways. And then finally, and I'm going to make a very brief set of observations about the free trade agreement with India, but I'm on the treaties committee. And so, as you would know, in Australia, the way that we incorporate treaties is that they don't take force of law just based upon the signing of them. They need to then go through parliamentary approval. And so the Treaties Committee is a very important step in that process. And so the EPTA came through the Treaties Committee, of which I'm a member. And as you may have seen, that committee recommended adoption, and the ECTA came into force on the 29th of December 2022. So that Treaties Committee is absolutely critical in the ongoing work in that state, but not just in relation to free trade agreements. The Treaties Committee, for example, examined the recent agreement between Australia and Japan on the ways in which troops might be located in each country. So it looks at all sorts of international agreements. It's a really very important committee. So that's the committee work. Please, anybody, if you're interested in macroeconomic issues, do reach out. But of course, if there's any specific inquiries, also feel free to reach out. I mean, most of these submission processes are fairly straightforward, so I'm sure you may be aware of. But if, for example, you want to engage on the insolvency inquiry, I'm more than happy to discuss. But if there are issues in relation to any of the inquiries that come up with the House Standing Committee, and there will, I think, be a couple of policy inquiries over the next 12 to 24 months, please do reach out. So I just wanted to make a couple of very brief observations on the state of the economy. And again, some of this is, observations on issues that you would probably be more familiar with than me. So it's not necessarily to tell you things that you don't know, but just really to reflect, in a sense, my thinking on where a very complicated situation has evolved over the last 12 months and where it might evolve over the next 12 to 24 months as we hope inflation unwinds a bit. The first observation, and I think it's an obvious one, but nonetheless it's worth making, is that the complicated economic situation we find ourselves in is really a supply side shock of a sort that we really haven't had for a long time. We've had a couple of major macroeconomic disruptions in the last 20 years. We had the GFC and we had the economic downturn which resulted from COVID. And both of those, according to orthodox macroeconomic theory, and the vast majority of macroeconomics, warranted a demand side response. So for government to step in, now we can always disagree on how much. We can always disagree on, whether it should be kickbacks or cash payments or laptops in schools, and they're important discussions. But fundamentally, most macroeconomists in both of those settings agreed that there should be a fiscal response. And in a sense, I would interpret this, and this would go way back to, the Great Depression, some of the big intellectual debates that occurred there. And I think there's now a broad, what you might call Keynesian consensus, that government intervention in response to those kinds of disruptions is warranted, albeit subject to all of those important debates around the details. There are some schools of economic thought that still hold to the view that you should step back and just let things play out. But I think it's fair to say that's a minority within the profession. So I think it's important to observe that this was a shock to the system that was unlike recent economic downturns. And I would say it was most similar to the supply side shocks of the early 1970s. So we're really talking about a period of 50 years that we have to go back to find a comparison point to. That's one point. The second point is I think that this is an inherently more difficult situation to manage than the kinds of shocks we experienced with GFC and COVID, as difficult as they were, partly because you're experiencing an economic downturn, but where you experience an economic downturn with prices increasing, it's very difficult on the fiscal side to do much because you risk exacerbating those inflationary pressures. So that makes it, in my view, an inherently more tricky situation. With the previous two downturns, public policy makers, people in government, people in the broader community, politicians were debating by and large how much to respond. But now we're faced with much more tricky balancing acts, I would say. And I think the government is getting it right at the moment. I think we have responded with targeted measures to assist people in particular groups in society, but it has had to be responses that are very measured, given that risk of exacerbating the underlying problem and the fact that the government rightly is committed to defeating inflation. So this time around, by and large, I would argue the inflationary pressures have come from external sources, obviously supply chain issues arising from COVID and the war in the Ukraine, the illegal invasion of the Ukraine by Russia, which had a massive impact on energy. I think a backdrop is also possibly, and this is hard to disentangle, but is the monetary policy hangover from the post-GFC period, where there was massive quantitative easing in many major economies. We had all sorts of unorthodox economic macro policy, quantitative easing, negative interest rates. I think only time will tell, but that may well have formed a part of the story as well. But I think the timing suggests that the principal immediate causes were supply chains and the energy impacts as a result of the invasion. And so that's really what countries like Australia face, an inflation challenge, which we're now seeing bear out with the last numbers obviously being 7.8. Hopefully that's the peak, and I think that's the expectation of Treasury and the Reserve Bank and most private forecasters. Those are the factors I think that largely underpin that. What are some of the lessons from the 1970s? I think that one of the lessons from the 1970s is that we have to be careful with stimulus because if not undertaken correctly, will exacerbate the inflationary pressures. And if we look at the US, for example, Alan Weiner, a professor at Princeton, recently completed an analysis of the last 10 quantitative monetary tightenings in the US over the last 50 to 80 years. He looked at the early 1970s and found that there was actually quite a bit of fiscal stimulus in the early 1970s at the time that the central bank, the Federal Reserve, was trying to deal with these inflationary pressures. Part of that was to do with the re-election of the Nixon government. So if we look at a lot of governments around the world in the 1970s, what we find is that fiscal policy and monetary policy were completely not aligned. And it's a really interesting counterpoint, I think, to where government right around the world are today. And the US wasn't the only one. Around the world in the 1970s, there was a very different understanding of the relationship between fiscal and monetary policy. But I think we can certainly learn lessons from that. And so if we fast forward to Australia, and I won't go through all the details, but if you look at the response in Australia over the last 12 months, or the last 8 months, the period of this government, I think there have been a series of measures to deal with cost of living pressures, but they've been suitably targeted. So one of them was an increase in the minimum wage, which I think was a really important mechanism to help people in particular need. There was cheaper medicines. There's been the price cap on energy, which I think is going to be a work in progress over the next couple of years because the energy market is so complicated. I think there's been a series of measures which have been very targeted. We've seen the amount of expenditure from the bottom line it has been limited, and I think by and large to date it has been quite effective. But I think to date the government has been very committed to not adding to inflationary pressures. The other thing I would say is that there was a bit of fiscal uplift in the lead up to the last budget, the October budget, as a result of resource prices and a slightly healthier labour market than had been expected. And the vast majority of that temporary fiscal uplift was returned to the budget, which again I think was a sensible, measured response. If that hadn't been ploughed back into spending, it actually would have made the whole job trickier. In preparation for today, I was just scouring through a few papers comparing the 70s and today. There was an interesting paper by the Brookings Institution which compared the 70s and today. And on a hopeful note, they made the observation that there are a few differences today which possibly will make the job a bit easier. And I think everybody's hoping that will be the case, because of course in the post-70s period, if you look at the Alan Volcker response, that was actually quite a brutal one in the early 80s. So we probably want to avoid that if possible. One is that inflation has obviously spiked in the US and Europe and Australia, but I think on most measures, that spike in most major economies has been less broad-based. So that's a good thing. What it means is that as supply chain troubles unwind, and hopefully increases in energy prices start to flatten out, even if they flatten out at a high level, if they stop increasing, that will take off inflationary pressure. If it's less broad-based, it's more likely that it will start to ease more quickly. Second is that there is a more credible monetary policy framework. Now, this is a contentious point, as I indicated earlier. There's not unanimity within the economic profession. There was an interesting survey of economists done about 10 years ago, top economists, both in public policy roles and top professors. On most microeconomic issues, there was 95% plus agreement. On most macroeconomic issues, there was often almost no agreement. So anything in the macro sphere is inherently more complicated. But I would argue that there is a much more coherent framework, intellectual and policy framework around monetary policy now than there was in the early 1970s. And I think that will help, because I think most central banks around the world in major economies are now undertaking actions such as targeting prices within a certain band that I think is much more consistent over time, that members of the community understand. And we can debate particular issues here and there, like was the wording of the governor in relation to forward guidance appropriate on this or that moment, but I would argue that the overall framework is much more sound than it was in the early 1970s. The third point, I think, is that many economies are more flexible than they were, and I would argue that in Australia, I think it's fair to say, and time will tell, but that our coming out of this economic downturn will be speedier with a more flexible economy than it would have been with a 1970s style economy, and that you could argue this is another payoff, another dividend from the 1980s micro reforms. And so I think that a more flexible economy in general will be better at dealing with these kinds of shocks, that capital and labour and resources are all more able to respond to all sorts of macro shocks within the economy. The second final point is that most economies, and this is, I think it's fair to say, a reflection of the general trend in economies as they develop to move towards services, are less capital intensive per unit of GDP. So if you plot energy inputs per $1,000 of GDP, in most major economies it's been coming down. Now, that's not any comfort to somebody in my electorate whose electricity prices are going up. Okay, so I've got to caveat that. Energy prices going up in Australia are a real problem. They are regressive. They hit people in poor communities a lot harder, and that's why the government has responded with the 12-month cap and other measures. But at the more macro level, it is worth noting that oil and other energy inputs per $1,000 of GDP is less than it was. And again, what that would suggest is that to the extent that those price increases start to flatten out, it should lead to economy-wide inflationary pressures easing faster than they might have in the 1970s. And finally, I think there is an argument that in this period, in most major economies, there is better alignment of fiscal and monetary policy. And that goes back to the point that I alluded to earlier. I think you can point to a number of countries in the 1970s where governments were actually undertaking expansionary fiscal policy at the wrong time. Now, that isn't to say that every government in the world is not making inflation worse in some regards at the moment, but I think in general, there's better alignment between fiscal and monetary policy at the moment in major economies around the world. So I think that will, I'm hoping, help not just Australia, but the globe, and the fact that everybody's interdependent should help everybody. So look, that's just some observations about what I see as some macro trends, but also how the Australian government is responding within that. I mean, the other high-level observation I would make, and this affects both our professions, but probably economists more so, is that forecasting is tough at the best of times. We're all bedeviled by that. But macroeconomic forecasting at the moment is extremely difficult because there are material factors that are, I would say, basically unforecastable. And this is where we moved from, risk to what I would call uncertainty, where basically it's almost impossible to put meaningful numerical estimates on it. So, when is the war in the Ukraine going to end? It's nearly impossible to put a number on that. And this is where macroeconomic forecasting becomes extremely difficult. So you do your best job, but you have to, I think, build really robust institutions that can adjust to updated information as it comes along. And many of you, particularly in private sector organisations, would live with that day to day. But I'm very conscious that in this environment, the macroeconomic settings are very, very difficult to pin down, and everybody's forecasting based on best information, but the next 12 to 24 months is very tricky to pin down. And that's where I think having the best institutional structure, so alignment between fiscal and monetary policy, for example, is so critical. So I just wanted to finish with a couple of observations on the ECTA. It's a really important agreement. As everybody in this room would know, it's a reflection of a discussion that's been going on for a long time. I think initial discussions might have started more than a decade ago. There were some difficulties, as there always are. These are very complicated agreements. It then got, I think, meshed and wrapped up into RCEP, and that was even more difficult in some ways, because when you're trying to set up a framework agreement for a quarter or a third of world GDP, that is inherently tricky because you've got all sorts of economies with different interest sets. But I think the fact that the ECTA is now where it's at between Australia and India is a really positive step. Some refer to it as an early harvest agreement, in that it's obviously not where we want to get to finally. We want to enter into a comprehensive economic agreement, but this is really important. And it's a really important step in reducing tariffs in a whole range of areas. I think that 85% of goods by value being exported to India will be tariff-free, and 90% after 6 years, and I think 96% coming from India and 100% after 6 years. So that's really important. Obviously, the services side of things is extremely important between our two countries, and that's something which we would want to see wrapped up into the broader agreement. The other thing I'd note is that I think there's a broader deepening of the relationship. So it's not just this ECTA as a kind of forerunner of a broader comprehensive economic agreement. I view this also in the broader context of the Quad and a deepening relationship along many dimensions. And I actually feel that they end up complementing each other and reinforcing each other. So certainly I see this as part of a much broader move forward and a very positive one. India is the sixth largest trading partner of Australia and fourth largest source of export. So it's already a deep relationship on the economic front, but there's much more that can be done. And the final observation I would make is that I started my career actually at the Attorney General's Department in the International Trade Law section, working through the minutiae of all these trade negotiations. I'm not sure whether economics or trade law is more exciting, but they both have pros and cons. But I certainly, back when I was in that role, APEC being formed, so it was an exciting time back in the mid-90s. But look, as important as trade is, one thing I would say is that an undervalued or underappreciated aspect of economic relationships is the investment flows and the FDI. We often talk about trade flows as being it. But for example, our trade flows with China at the moment are extremely significant. And Australia has gone through periods where we've had a major partner. So this is not unprecedented. We've gone through smaller kinds of periods with Japan, with the UK. So that has pros and cons. And the pro is that you're trading a lot. The con is that sometimes it can create risks. But I only raise that to flag that the trade relationship with China at the moment is extremely important. But on the FDI side, the relationship with the USA is 20 times bigger, or 15 to 20 times bigger. But, in a sense, in the economic policy discussion, that really doesn't often warrant much attention at all. So there's quite significant investment flows between India and Australia, tens of billions each way. But it does strike me that in addition to moving to a broader-based free trade agreement, the investment flows are a really interesting opportunity for our two economies also. For Australia, we're sitting on a top 5 pool of retirement savings, so we're punching way above our weight there. And to me, the incredibly exciting opportunity is the opportunity for some of that to be invested productively in India, which is the big growth opportunity in the world when it comes to GDP growth in the next 20 to 30 years. And interestingly also, many of those bigger funds in Australia, the 100 billion plus funds, are now very much involved in unlisted asset transactions. So that's where you get really interesting opportunities to, in a sense, have those kind of FDI relationships where you purchase an asset but then get involved in its management, in the transfer flow. So I think there's a really huge potential there. But then obviously the other way as well. I mean, India is, as I said, I think the awakening giant in the world economy, and Australia will benefit massively, I think, from over time and growing FDI flows from India. FDI flows don't just bring capital in and all the benefits there, capital deepening, greater labour productivity, but also I think all the technology transfers and knowledge transfers. And there are many areas where India is already, but even more areas where India will become a world leader. A lot of the topics today, like data analysis, AI, and I think it's going to benefit us massively for those flows to be coming into Australia. So, yeah, I just wanted to flag that the ECTA was a really positive step. It's a step in a longer journey, but I also wanted to flag that I think over the longer term, I'd also be really hopeful that we can look at barriers to capital flows, which I think is a real opportunity for both countries. So thank you very much for the chance to be here today. I had a look at the list of speakers and some really important topics on at least important to your profession, but also many of the topics that you've got listed today are actually things that government is focusing on as well. So congratulations on pulling together such a big list of speakers, and thanks for being able to be here to share it with you.
And that is, so the question is, what you think that in unprecedented situation put forward, federal government to take over the monetary policy and align with fiscal policy? And this is first to respond as an economic, not as a political. So,
Yeah, so look, I think by the government, I suspect what the question alludes to is the executive taking over monetary policy. So if I interpret it correctly, it's that we should have more government control over central banks and the setting of cash rates, for example. And look, I'm not a monetary policy expert, so this is me as somebody who knows a bit of macro, but I'm giving my thoughts on this. And you know, if I was going to write an essay on it, so I'd probably hit the books and do a bit of research to make sure that some of my claims are true. But I do remember back in the 80s and 90s, there was a really big debate around the pros and cons of independent central banks or more independent central banks. If you go back to, say, the 80s, the relationship between the RBA and Treasury was very different to what it is today. And de facto, the government of the day would have a huge influence on setting the cash rate. Now, one of the arguments in favour of independent central banks is that they, firstly, will be much more committed to getting inflation back within a certain band if it's out of control, because they will basically be more willing than the government of the day to put up with the economic pain associated with that. Generally, if you've got inflation running above your target rate and you want to bring it back, you're going to have to use monetary policy in such a way that it dampens demand, which of course will generally mean pushing up unemployment, will generally mean creating pain in the community. And the argument would be, if that cash rate setting or the setting of monetary policy is left to the government of the day, that decision making will be too subject to the electoral cycle and not to the economic policy needs. So that's one of the key arguments in favour of an independent central bank. Another one might be that central banks can develop a pool of expertise and make more rigorous expert decisions based on these very complicated sets of issues. So I think by and large in the 80s and 90s, most countries moved towards more independent central banks. And it wasn't just that, but they moved towards independent central banks. They moved towards setting inflation targets within a certain band. Not all central banks have that, but the number that operate using that mechanism has increased over the last 30 years. And that, in fact, is one of the key issues that's being looked at in the review of the Reserve Bank at the moment. So I don't want to prejudge where that's going to land. But by and large, my personal view is that that was probably, on balance, a positive and necessary move. I think if we are going to, as a community, say that we want to keep inflation within certain bounds, the governance arrangement of an independent central banks, I think, is an important aspect of that. And I do think that having low and stable inflation is a worthwhile goal, because once inflation gets beyond a target, once as a society and the government of the day, we're not particularly committed to inflation being in a band, I believe the problem is that it creates a lot of uncertainty, that it can be very hard to rein back in, and that it's more often than not the least well off in our community, people on fixed incomes, people least able to bear risk, who suffer the most. So my overarching observation would be that I think a commitment to low and stable inflation is a very worthwhile macroeconomic goal. And I think by and large, independent central banks on balance are better at achieving that than where central banks are completely enmeshed in the government of the day and its agenda. Having said that, there's all sorts of devil in the detail, and that isn't to say that there's lots of different models whereby that can be achieved. And so one of the issues that we're looking at in Australia at the minute is the composition of the board. Should it have more economic experts on it? Are there too many business interests? Should it have a union rep? So the composition of the board is a really important issue there. There's also an issue around, should there be a separate board within the central bank for setting the cash rate? So they have that, I think the UK and Canada, that's a really important governance issue. So even allowing for the fact that you might have a commitment to an independent central bank, there are then all sorts of governance debates within that.